Introduction. Not naked, not dressed.
Around 1900, the female body could already appear before the camera with surprising boldness, sometimes almost openly, sometimes behind a veil, sometimes under the name of art, theater, costume, or private toilette. But the most revealing photographs are not always the most naked ones. What matters here is the threshold. A body partly covered by fabric, a dress not yet fastened, a corset still visible, a shoulder exposed as if by accident, a mirror, a bed, a curtain, a dressing table, all the signs of privacy arranged for a public image. These women are not simply dressed, but they are not simply naked either. They stand or recline or turn toward the mirror in an intermediate zone between exposure and concealment, between intimacy and performance, between the private room and the circulating photograph. And that is where early photography learned one of its most durable lessons. It did not always need to show the body completely. It only needed to give the viewer permission to look. This film is not about nudity alone. It is about the visual strategies that made the body visible before it could be shown openly. Drapery, lingerie, corsets, mirrors, theater, advertising. The careful arrangement of an almost private moment, not naked, not dressed, held in the space where modern visual desire learned how to excuse itself.
Chapter 1. A Permission to Look.
To understand these photographs, we have to begin with a small but important distinction. A body can be visible and still not be presented as simple nudity. That distinction mattered around 1900. Photography could show the body very directly. There were nude studies, there were erotic postcards, there were stereoscopic images made for private viewing. There were photographs that circulated more quietly, outside respectable public display. But the images we are looking at here often work differently. They do not simply expose the body, they prepare it for looking. A woman is shown as an actress, a dancer, a model, a figure from mythology, a woman at her toilette, a performer in costume, a body being dressed, adjusted, reflected, arranged. Each role gives the image a reason to exist. The viewer is not asked to say, "I am looking at a naked body." The viewer is offered another explanation. This is theater. This is fashion. This is art. This is beauty. This is a private moment accidentally made visible. This is a woman preparing herself before she enters the world. The excuse is part of the image. The corset, the mirror, the curtain, the loose robe, the stage costume, the studio chair. These are not just props. They are visual permissions. They tell us how to look. They soften the exposure. They move the image away from direct nakedness and towards something more acceptable, more ambiguous, and often more seductive. This is why the threshold is so important. The photograph does not need to show everything. It only needs to hold the body at the moment when it can still be explained, as dressing, as performance, as art, as preparation, as pose. The body becomes public by being made indirect, and in that indirectness, the image gains its power.
Chapter 2. The Alibi of Art.
One of the oldest permissions was art. Before photography, European painting had already developed the language for showing the body without calling it ordinary nakedness. The nude could appear as Venus, as a nymph, as Diana, as an allegory of night, spring, beauty, innocence, or desire. The body was visible, but it was protected by a name. Photography inherited this language. A woman could be placed against a painted landscape, wrapped in a light fabric, turned into a bather, a classical figure, a dream, a decorative form. The studio did not need to look real. Often, it worked better when it did not. The painted backdrop, the artificial branch, the veil, the moon, the flowers, all these elements move the image away from an ordinary room and into a safer space. Not a woman undressed before the camera, a figure. Not a private body, an image of art. But photography also changes the old convention. In painting, the body is mediated by the hand. In photography, it remains tied to the presence of a real person before a real camera. So the alibi of art never fully removes the tension. The drapery says, this is classical. The pose says, this is composed. The backdrop says, this belongs to an imagined world. But the photograph keeps returning us to the body itself, a shoulder, a waist, a knee, the pressure of fabric against skin. This is why these images feel suspended between two traditions. They borrow the authority of art, but they also offer the immediacy of photography. And in that space, the body becomes visible, not as simple nudity, but as something staged, named, and made acceptable through beauty.
Chapter 3. The Garment That Reveals.
After art, there was another kind of permission, clothing itself. Not the finished dress, not the public costume of the street, the theater lobby, or the respectable portrait, but the layer underneath. The corset, the chemise, the petticoat, the stocking, the robe before it is closed. These garments had a double function. In ordinary life, they belonged to the private sequence of dressing. They were not meant to be the final public appearance of the body. But in photography, they could become visible. And once they became visible, they changed meaning. The corset is especially important here. It covers the torso. It shapes the waist. It gives the body structure, ornament, and a kind of formal discipline. But at the same time, it announces that something is incomplete. A woman shown in a corset is not simply undressed. She is also almost dressed. The image can say she is preparing herself. She is adjusting the last layer. She is before the mirror, before the dress, before the public world. That before is what makes the image work. The viewer is placed inside a suspended moment, a moment that appears private, but has clearly been staged for the camera. The garment becomes a threshold. It conceals enough to make the image acceptable. It reveals enough to make it charged. The chemise softens the body. The corset defines it. The stocking draws attention downward. The loose robe suggests that something has just been removed or is about to be put on. Nothing here is accidental. The fabric is doing visual work. It does not simply hide the body. It teaches the viewer where to look. At the shoulder, at the waist, at the line of lacing, at the contrast between covered fabric and uncovered skin. This is why these photographs often feel more suggestive than a direct nude. A nude can be classified as art, study, or erotica, but the partly dressed body remains unstable. It belongs to a moment. The woman is not presented as a statue or a mythological figure now. She is closer to the room, closer to the mirror, closer to the act of dressing. The image does not show an ordinary private moment. It manufactures one. And the corset, or the chemise, or the loosened robe becomes the device that makes this manufactured intimacy visible.
Chapter 4. The Staged Private Room.
The garment is only one part of the scene. Around it, photography builds a room, a mirror, a curtain, a bed, a dressing table, a screen, a chair placed just close enough to the body. These objects tell us where we are supposed to be. Not in the street, not in the public portrait studio, not in the finished world of social appearance. We are meant to feel that we have entered a private room. But this privacy is constructed. The mirror does not simply reflect the woman. It multiplies the act of looking. She looks at herself, the camera looks at her, and the viewer is allowed to look at both. The dressing table works in the same way. A comb, a bottle, a flower, a folded garment, small objects that suggest an ordinary ritual of preparation. But in the photograph, they become theatrical signs. They tell us, this is not nakedness. This is toilette. This is dressing. This is the private work of becoming visible. The room gives the image its excuse. Without the mirror, without the curtain, without the signs of preparation, the body might appear too direct. With them, it becomes a scene. The viewer is not simply looking at a woman. The viewer is looking at a moment arranged as if it had been interrupted. And that interruption is part of the pose. The private room becomes public by pretending not to be public. It is not the bedroom itself that we see. It is the idea of a bedroom, not privacy, the image of privacy. And early photography returned to this fiction again and again because it solved a problem. It allowed the body to appear under the protection of a setting. The body was not only dressed or undressed, it was placed, framed by furniture, softened by fabric, doubled by a mirror, and made visible as if we had arrived just one moment too soon.
Chapter 5. The Body in Circulation.
But the private room was only one stage. The same visual logic appears in more public forms, on the theater stage, in the circus, in music hall publicity, in postcards, in cigarette cards, in advertisements. Here, the body is no longer pretending to be purely private. It becomes performance. A dancer can show more because she is dancing. An actress can appear more freely because she is already a public image. A circus performer can wear a costume close to underwear because the costume belongs to an act. Performance gives exposure a reason. The body is visible because it has a role. And once the body has a role, it can travel. It can be printed on a postcard, collected in an album, sold with cigarettes, placed in a shop window, used to advertise a corset, a stocking, a theater, a style of beauty. The image becomes portable. This is where staged intimacy becomes a market. The woman is no longer only before the camera. She is inside a system of circulation. Bought, exchanged, kept, displayed, sometimes hidden, sometimes sent through the mail. And the same alibis remain in place: costume, pose, theater, fashion, art, health, elegance. A corset advertisement does not say, "Look at this body." It says, "Look at support, comfort, posture, modern design." A theater card does not say, "Look at undress." It says, "Look at talent, role, performance, charm." But the body remains the center of attention. The language changes, the gaze does not. This is why these images matter. They show not only what could be seen, but how seeing was organized. Around 1900, photography did not simply capture bodies. It helped build a visual economy around them. A body could be softened by drapery, protected by art, framed by a private room, structured by clothing, justified by performance, and finally, circulated as an object of desire. Not always naked, not always dressed, but increasingly available as an image.
Closing. The excuse to look.
In these images, the body is rarely shown without a reason. It is given a name, a costume, a mirror, a curtain, a room, a role, a product, a pose. Each element makes the body easier to see and easier to explain. That is why the most revealing photographs are not always the most naked ones. A direct nude can be classified as art, as study, as erotica. But the partly dressed body is harder to fix. It remains in motion, dressing or undressing, private or performed, interrupted or arranged, hidden enough to be acceptable, visible enough to hold the gaze. Around 1900, photography did not simply record this ambiguity, it learned how to use it. The camera could turn a dressing room into a stage, a corset into a sign, a mirror into an invitation, a postcard into a private object of public desire. These photographs show more than bodies. They show the culture that made looking possible. Not naked, not dressed, held in the interval where exposure could still pretend to be something else.
For more stories hidden in old photographs, subscribe to Reading Frames.